the Godless Engineer, and today is Fallacy Friday. Alright, now that we're done with the propositional fallacies, we're going to head into the syllogistic fallacies. Now, the syllogistic fallacies are some of the oldest fallacies that we know. They go all the way back to Aristotle, and he's the OG of fallacies. He's actually known as the first formal logician, which is pretty much the same thing as, magician, but, with logic. Over the years, there have been several tests that have been developed in order to determine if a syllogistic argument is a fallacy. And these tests include rules, diagrams, as well as poems sometimes. The sub-fallacies that come under the banner title of syllogistic fallacies are known as rule-breaking type of fallacy. If the argument breaks any one of these certain rules, then it's going to be fallacious. First, though, we have to understand some basic concepts about syllogistic fallacies in order to actually determine if these arguments are going to be fallacious or validating. So let's just take a second and learn a few things about syllogistic arguments in general. Syllogistic premises usually come in one of four types of statements. There's the type A fallacy, which says that all S are P. So, for instance, all Christians are dumbasses. Type E arguments come in the form of no S are P. The example for this would be no person is possessed by a spirit. Type I arguments normally look like some S are P. And the example for that would be some Christians are decent people. Type O arguments come in the form of some S are not P. So an example of this would be some Christians are not psychopaths. These are the four basic types of premises that you'll find in any categorical syllogistic argument. The placeholder letters of S and P stand for subject and predicate. Normally, the subject comes first in the premise, and then the predicate comes second. So just try to remember that, keep it straight as I go through these fallacies. These are known as categorical syllogisms, meaning that the terms S and P have to be categories of things, like Christians or people, and not too specific, like Kim Kardashian or my wife, that kind of thing. Now, typically in a categorical syllogism, in any one premise, you have these two, the subject and the predicate, and what you're going to do is you're going to combine them with a couple other statements in order to form a conclusion. Now, you'll also notice that some of these letters are bolded. The bolded letters denote distributed terms. The unbolded letters denote an undistributed term. Now, I'm going to assume that you don't understand what the terms distributed and undistributed mean, at least with syllogistic arguments. So I'm going to take you through that real quick. A distributed term basically means that you can replace that category with a more specific category that is still in that set. So, for instance, like people, and then you could further define that as Christians or agnostics, secularists, atheists, Muslims, so you can go on down the list. Now, with an undistributed term, that means that you can't replace that particular category with something else. Like if you replace it with something else, then it means something different. Now, the basic format of any syllogistic argument is going to contain three lines. You have your major premise, your minor premise, and then your conclusion. This leads us to our first set of fallacies to discuss, the illicit process. Now, the illicit process can come in two flavors, major and minor. Now, with each one references a specific premise. And the rule that these fallacies are breaking is that if you have a term in your conclusion that is distributed and then it's undistributed in your premise, then it's fallacious. You can't do that. So the actual rule would be that if your term is distributed in the conclusion, then it has to also be distributed in the premise in which it is stated. So let's tackle the illicit major first. Illicit major fallacy means that your undistributed term is in your major premise, which is that first premise that is stated. So let's take a look at a fallacious argument and see if we can figure out why it is exactly fallacious. All Bill O'Reilly fans are dumbasses. No atheists are fans of Bill O'Reilly. Therefore, no atheists are dumbasses. If we go to our table of these syllogistic premise forms, you'll notice that this particular one is in the form of AEE. And that means that the undistributed term is in the major premise, while the distributed term is, of course, in the conclusion. So we have an imbalance there. Now you see the problem with having an imbalance in your distribution is that in your conclusion, you can apply that to more than one subcategory of that particular thing. So that is the problem there. Not to mention the fact that our conclusion is pretty factually false. I mean, I've been a dumbass before. I've been it multiple times. My wife is sure as shit not gonna stop herself from calling me a dumbass now.
You got that right, dumbass.
Now let's have fun with another fallacy, shall we? Some Catholic priests are pedophiles. No Muslims are Catholic priests. Therefore, no Muslims are pedophiles. First of all, pedophilia is a human problem. It is not centered on one particular group or faith or denomination or anything. It's a human problem. Anybody can be a pedophile. I mean, they have something fucked up in their heads. It's biological. So to say that Muslims can't be pedophiles is really disingenuous because, you know, there are still a lot of Muslim groups out there that support child marriages. And, you know, of course, that's because of their prophet, you know, Muhammad being what we would call today a pedophile. You know, he married little Aisha when she was 6, and of course he was a fucking gentleman about it and waited till she was 9 to, you know, statutorily rape her. Now, let's take a look at a decent syllogistic argument, shall we? Some Christians are bigoted people. All funny Christians are, of course, Christian, duh, right? Therefore, all funny Christians are bigoted people. Now, this is completely reasonable to assume because fundamentalist Christians take the Bible literally. I mean, they believe that it is the inerrant word of God. And in the Bible, it has places where you kill rape victims and you stone homosexuals. And it's even prevalent today. If you don't know about Pastor Anderson out in New Mexico and his little pal in Texas, Donnie Romero, they actually want the government to step in and start killing homosexuals, stoning the fuck out of them. So these are very relevant criticisms to fundamentalist Christians because they hate people for no reason, or at least they want them to die. They may claim they don't hate them, but I'm sorry. If I want somebody to die, it's because I hate them for some reason. If you don't believe me that they're actually making these arguments, take a fucking look real quick.
Because I actually discovered the cure for AIDS. This is the cure for AIDS, okay? Look, we could have an AIDS-free world by Christmas. Because if you executed the homos like God recommends, you wouldn't have all this AIDS running rampant.
Amen to what Pastor Anderson said. I'm not going to let any of these dirty faggots inside my church. And I'm not going to, these guys, they are all pedophiles. Look in the Bible.
No homos will ever be allowed on this church as long as I'm the pastor here. Never!
Now, what we want to focus on here, though, is the form that this syllogistic argument is in, and it's IAA. What this has is an even distribution of all your terms across the premises and the conclusion. So therefore, it's not fallacious, at least in a syllogistic argument sense. Also, another thing that it has working for it is that it's reasonable. It's reasonable to assume that funny Christians are going to be bigoted just because of their Bible. Now, the illicit minor fallacy is going to work exactly like the illicit major fallacy, with the exception that the undistributed term is going to appear in the minor premise, which is the second premise in the argument. So let's take a look at an example and see if we can spot the form of it and how it's a fallacy. All Christians are people. Some people are assholes, of course. Therefore, all assholes are Christians. Now, as you can see, the minor premise term of assholes is undistributed in the actual premise, but yet it is distributed in the conclusion. This is a fallacy. You have done gone and fucked yourself up. Not to mention the fact that it's unreasonable to think that all assholes are going to be Christian. I'm an asshole sometimes. I freely admit it. Sometimes I feel like an asshole kind of attitude is needed in some cases, especially when dealing with assholes themselves. So, therefore, it's reasonable to assume that this argument is false, just by the all-inclusive nature of the conclusion itself, but also from a syllogistic point of view, it is still fallacious. Let's check out another example of this fucked up fallacy, shall we? All atheists are immoral people. Some immoral people are Nazi sumbitches. Therefore, all Nazi sumbitches are atheists. Now, despite the major premise here being factually fucking false, the actual argument is still a fallacy because of the illicit minor rule. The fact that you've got to have a distributed term in the minor premise as well as your conclusion if your conclusion is going to have a distributed term. So the minor term here being Nazi some bitches is undistributed in the minor premise and is distributed in the conclusion. And so that's how it's a syllogistic fallacy. That's how it commits an illicit minor fallacy. Now, on to the actual argument. It's pretty false, like factually false, that the Nazis were atheists in general. I mean, that's not to say that all of them had to be Christians, but for the most part, they were Catholic. And Catholic is a type of Christian because they follow Christ. Hitler was Catholic, of course, and he structured his entire regime around a Christian agenda, mainly to stomp out the Jews because they crucified their mythical lord. If someone tries to sell you on the idea that Hitler was an atheist or Hitler wasn't a Christian, you need to stomp that shit out quick, because it's just plain false. You can always bring up Gott mit uns that they had on their frickin' belts. You could bring up any number of things, any of his speeches where he actually calls out God, saying that he is doing God's work. Of course, the standard retaliation to that is for Christians to say that he wasn't a real Christian or he wasn't really Christian. Now, that is just a no true Scotsman fallacy that we'll actually cover in the informal fallacy portion of this series. But for right now, just know that it's fucking bullshit. Now, we're going to go on to our next fallacy of exclusive premises. Now, an exclusive primacy fallacy is a fallacy where your entire syllogistic argument is constructed of nothing but negative assertions. The rule that this particular fallacy breaks is the fact that you have to have at least one positive assertion in your syllogistic argument. Now, just to emphasize, that doesn't mean that every single argument that you hear that is full of nothing but negative assertions is going to be fallacious. It's only fallacious in a syllogistic argument of the types that we are about to go through. So how about we take a look at a fallacious argument of this type. No people are homosexual. No animals are people, of course. Therefore, no animals are homosexual. Now, of course, this follows with the whole, there's no positive assertions, in our argument. Therefore, we can't make any conclusions off of that. But more to the point of the argument, it's just disingenuous for you to say that there are no homosexual animals when there clearly are. There's a lot of species out there that are actually homosexual. They practice homosexuality. So, it's not that every single animal in that species does it. It's just that those are the known species that actually practice it. I know one of them is goats and lions and whatnot. So, But it's pretty factually false from a scientific standpoint to say that there are no homosexual animals, because there obviously are. And in that way, it's quite unreasonable to make the assertion that there are no homosexual animals.
Not to mention the fact that people themselves are in fact animals. We are classified as animals. So it just kind of piles on to this whole, disingenuous aspect of saying that no animals are homosexual.
Now for our final fallacy of tonight, we're going to go with undistributed middle. Now, this particular fallacy is fairly easy to determine because your middle term in this fallacy, which is the term that is used to connect the major premise and the minor premise, is undistributed in both locations. Now, the rule that this breaks is the fact that you have to have your middle term distributed in at least one of the premises. So you really don't want to fuck this up, okay? One big difference in this fallacy is that it actually does come up in common arguments that you might have, or common discussions that you might have. And I'm going to show you some examples of how that could come up with some relevant information. So let's start with our first example. All religious terrorists are religious people. All Muslims are, of course, religious people. Therefore, all Muslims are religious terrorists. If you'll remember from our grid earlier, the A-type argument has an undistributed predicate, which would be the religious people portion of this argument. And so since the religious people aspect is the middle term, it is undistributed in both premises. Therefore, you cannot make any kind of conclusion off of this statement. Also, this is pretty much the common argument to say that all Muslims are religious terrorists. You're going to hear this kind of argument in the real world. So, the undistributed middle term in this, the religious people portion of it, fucks this argument over big time. Because you can't, it's quite unreasonable to say that all Muslims are going to be religious terrorists. Now, if you wanted to say all radical Muslims are religious terrorists, you could possibly make an argument off that. How about we rework this particular argument into a validating form? All religious terrorists are religious people. Some religious people are Muslim. Therefore, some religious terrorists are Muslim. Of course, let's think about this whole argument logically. It does fit with the schema to not break the undistributed middle fallacy, but more so to the point, logically it makes sense that not all Muslims are going to be religious terrorists. That there's only going to be some religious terrorists in general that are Muslim. And I'd like to give you some examples of how there are terrorists other than Muslim. Here's just a simple list of terrorist attacks carried out by Christians. Number 1, Wisconsin Sikha Temple Massacre, August 5th, 2012. Number 2, murder of Dr. George Tiller, May 31st, 2009. Number 3, Knoxville Unitarian Universalist Church shooting, July 27th, 2008. Number 4, the murder of Dr. John Britton, July 29th, 1994. Number 5, Centennial Olympic Park bombing, July 27th, 1996. Number 6, murder of Barnett Slepian, August 23rd, 1998. Number 7, Planned Parenthood bombing, Brookline, Massachusetts, 1994. There are also plenty of Christian terrorist organizations that are currently working in the United States. Just a brief list of them would include Phineas Priesthood, Army of God, and the Ku Klux Klan. How about we take a look at another example and try to finish our fallacies on a little bit better note. Some Christians are fans of Ray Comfort. All dumbasses are fans of Ray Comfort. Therefore, all dumbasses are Christian. As I've stated before in this video, I've been a dumbass multiple times. And as you heard before, my wife's not afraid to call me out on it when I am, in fact, a dumbass.
Ew.
I'm sure that you have had your own experiences with dumbasses. You might be considering me to be a dumbass right now. That's perfectly fine. Being a dumbass is not restricted by faith at all. You can be a dumbass with no matter your faith or ideology or association of any kind. Thank you for joining me today. As I stated before last week in my video, I will try to keep up another logical fallacy video next week. Hopefully posting sometime in the AM, more like around 10 a.m. So I hope you will join me then. Please like and comment below with your thoughts on these fallacies. And I would really like you to try to create your own fallacies. They're actually quite fun, and they're a little difficult because you have to think fallaciously, and that might seem a little bit hard at first, because I know that's one thing that I've had a lot of trouble with. So please comment below with your own constructed fallacy and try to be creative about it. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can stay tuned for next week when we go over more syllogistic fallacies. And as always, don't forget to